As I mentioned before, a focus this week, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I was less interested in the temptation than that other part of that prayer. What does it mean, and what is evil? And what does it mean, a kind of larger part of that, what does it mean to be delivered from evil? And my wife can testify, I spent the week asking people, what do you think it means to say something is evil? And I got lots of different answers. I asked friends and family, and what is evil to you in this world? And I had lots of different answers. Intentional acts of cruelty, kind of self-egoistic kind of way of being in the world. There were lots of different answers to that question. And in many ways, evil is a word that's kind of packed. It's not necessarily a word we use all the time, but it's a word that's kind of packed with lots of meaning. And I remembered reading something about Hannah Arendt. She was a political theorist, a philosopher in the 20th century, and she was sent by the New York Times to report on the war crimes of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, I believe it was sent to report on that. And she made these very interesting observations while she was there. She described Eichmann, let me see if I can get this right, as a rather ordinary, rather bland bureaucrat who was neither perverted or sadistic, but as she put it, terrifyingly normal. He was not, she said, inherently evil, but shallow and callous, a joiner seeking advancement in his political party. And she coined the phrase, many of you may have heard it, the banality of evil. The banality of what is evil. Now, when we think of evil, we tend to think of something rather large, something huge, a man going into a mosque or a synagogue or a school and shooting people up. Yes, that's evil. Terrorists flying planes into buildings. Yes, that's evil. Mass murderers. Yes, that's easily identified as evil. And yet, this idea of the banality of evil is something not inherent or extraordinary, but the reality that evil exists around us. And in many ways, when we think of evil in that way, we can always shove it to another person. It has nothing to do with us, right? Evil is the opponent or the person who has done these horrible, intentional things to harm people. Evil is not something that necessarily is a part of our existence. And yet we might call evil a system in which a cancer patient is denied help because of insurance. Or we might call evil a system of inequalities to such a great extent that we have these symbols of opulence and wealth right next door to people who are hungry and homeless. Is that not evil? Or a corporation which seeks profit over the health and safety of other people, over the health and safety of creation, is that not evil? But we're a little uncomfortable with that because the banality of evil means that it might exist all around us and that we might be caught up in it ourselves. Thomas Merton, a monk who lived in the 60s, famously wrote this passage in his reflections. He says, everybody, if they sit in silence enough, if they pray enough, if they really still their hearts and minds enough, if they look deep within their soul, they would find within their soul, every one of us, the capacity for Auschwitz or Watts. And so the evil we want to push off to others, especially those we might disagree with. Someone in a different political party, someone who believes differently from ourselves. We would like to name them evil, and yet the banality of evil is that it is much a part of our lives. There's a great book written by Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1930s, and the title of the book was Moral Man and Immoral Society. And his argument was, actually, we can be good people, doing good things, moral people, but we could live in a system that does great evil. A system that may treat women as less, as objects, as diminished. A system that may treat people of color in such a way, even though I may not hold those ideas or beliefs, somehow I'm part of something that occurs every single day that I might call evil. And so the hard part of this passage for me is that when we say deliver us from evil, in many ways it's not evil as something outside myself. Actually, what that's saying is deliver us from ourselves, right? Because we're all part of it. There's no escaping it. We yearn or should yearn to be delivered from ourselves. So we read this story this morning. Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and he asks his disciples, hey, all I need you to do is be present to me, is be praying with me. And then he goes off, not far, a stone's throw, they says, and he's off praying, powerfully praying, hurting, facing the reality. This is the night before his crucifixion, facing the reality of the evil of the world seemingly bearing down upon him. And I mean, the description in Luke, the power of that prayer, the pain he's feeling, and when he goes back, the disciples are all asleep, right? Now, it's interesting, the line says they were sleeping because of grief. Now, I think the first thing we should know about delivering us from ourselves, from the evil of the world and the evil that can be part of our souls, the first thing is we got to wake up, don't we? We got to wake up to the reality of the world around us, reality of racism and homophobia and the ways in which women, again, are treated as objects. We got to be aware of the brokenness in the world. Pay attention. We can't sleepwalk through the banality of evil. You got to be awake and aware to see it. So the first step in our deliverance is raising our awareness. And the second step, now, it's interesting, I can understand how those disciples, they were so filled with grief that they looked at the world and saw all the evil in it. Here, their teacher, their friend, their master, he's about to be killed. They can see the writing on the wall. And so what do they want to do? What do we all want to do? We want to run away. Don't we? We don't want to face it. It grieves us to see such pain in the world. We don't want to really be that aware of it. We'd rather sleepwalk through the banality of evil. And the second thing that strikes me about us being delivered from ourselves by God, from the evil that surrounds us, is not only being awake, but we have to be empathic. That what Jesus wanted from his disciples was not simply being awake, but wanted to be connected to them empathically, wanted them to feel his pain, to know the pain of the world. And in fact, we cannot do evil if we are awake and if we are empathic, even with those we disagree with. Evil only happens when we make it a characteristic of the other, when we other them, whoever that might be. Evil only happens when we don't see the humanity of the other. And finally, I think the only way we can combat evil, the only way in which we might be delivered from evil, it's kind of a scary thought, but it's a willingness to be vulnerable. The enemy of evil is not to be in control. It's not to be necessarily in charge. The enemy of evil is a willingness to be vulnerable to it, to make oneself vulnerable to face it. I mean, that's a rather scary idea, is it not? We hear a joke this week, a racist joke. It might be a neighbor or a coworker. We hear this racist joke, and first of all, we have to be aware it's racist, and second, we have to be willing to be vulnerable to say, hey, that's not right. To combat and be delivered from evil requires of us a capacity to willingness to put ourselves out there so that evil cannot prosper. And as I thought about those three things, about being awake, about being empathic, about willingness to be vulnerable, that I can't help but think those are three distinct definitions for grace. The gift of God's love, of how God approaches us, aware of and awake to our human condition. A God who connects and relates empathically to our pain and our struggle, just as he did on the cross. And a God who used grace, who was willing to come and be vulnerable to us, to human history, to the world, so that we might be delivered from the evil of our own making. I pray, I encourage us, as we go out into the world, we need a people who are awake, who are empathic, and who are willing to be vulnerable. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.